morning, and thanks to everyone for coming. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. So I really thank the organizers of this conference, and I've really enjoyed everything so far. And I hope to be able to give you a little bit of information. We heard earlier we've been hearing about nutrient density issues. Tom sort of brought that forward early on. Andrea talked about that some more. Before I get started, real quick, I wanted to comment that the macular degeneration also involves a lot with zeaxanthin in our food supply. And I think in food processing to some extent, and perhaps reduction in consumption of green vegetables has contributed to that at a population level as well. Yeah, so that's another area that I think is interesting. So I'm here today to talk to you about a very interesting opportunity that we have within our agency, the Agricultural Research Service, on this soil health, human health project, which, let me see, move forward here, which seems to have had various names. When I first got involved with it, we were calling it the Healthy Soil, Healthy Foods, Healthy People Initiative. It's an opportunity to really bridge the activities, as you've heard, between the Mandan ARS lab on soil health and nutrient management issues, our center in Fargo on food quality improvement, and on human nutrition and human health evaluations through the USDA ARS Human Nutrition Research Center in Grand Forks. And really it's an opportunity to look at this question of, does soil health or improvements in soil health have an impact on our nutritional quality of our food supply? And does that actually then translate to improved nutrition and health of consumers? And recognizing that, of course, as producers, you're producing crop plants or livestock, animal foods that is profitable to you, but really, in the end of the day, we're providing food and nutrition to consumers. And so we have an opportunity here because of new funding that's come to the agency to move on this initiative. We actually already have been working as a group. I've been in Fargo now for 3 years as a center director, and when I first came on board, I think the second day that I was actually in Fargo, I came to Mandan, so I had an early opportunity to learn about this initiative and start working with people on this. And so this is a real interesting opportunity for us. Now, having said that, this is just starting. We don't have a lot of results to present to you at this point. And so instead, what I want to do is use this talk to really talk about conceptually and really expand on things that Andrea said and some of the comments that Tom gave earlier, and Mark as well, on how this system fits together and what we could be looking at and what is the basis for this idea. And so really, I think in large part, part of our agricultural challenge is asking this question of how do we manage and maintain our soils, our crops, and our broader environment to ensure that we are providing a safe, nutritious, and sustainable supply of food for all people. And so the way I look at this, and I think as a group, I hope my colleagues are looking at it this way as well, is that we really do have this common framework of looking at our soil resources, looking at our production agriculture, whether it's, again, either plants which are fed directly to humans or plants as forages that are going into livestock, and then sort of indirect food sources for humans. And really it all revolves around this concept of food. And so I think all of these areas come together around this topic and reminding us, and I remind you that at the end of the day, those soil resources are providing nutrients to the plants are providing nutrients to the livestock or the humans, but we don't just eat those nutrients, we actually eat foods that contain nutrients. And so the quality of that food is really what we need to be thinking about. And from the soil perspective, it's really that we don't just need soil to grow the plants in, but we need a healthy soil that contains and provides those nutrients. And so what is it about the soil? What is it about how we manage that soil that really leads to that area of getting those mineral nutrients into the plants and then passing through the whole value chain through the food system and into humans. And we heard a lot already about nutrient levels. We heard some talk about nutrient density. So I'm going to expand on that a little bit, maybe give a little bit of a different twist to it, a different flavor to it, but really sort of reflecting on some of the comments that have been made already. So let me conceptualize this a little bit in a little more detail. Again, thinking about healthy soils. What those soils provide are minerals to the growing plant. And the soils themselves have lots of different conditions and factors that relate to how those soils can provide those nutrients. We have biotic factors such as microbes and insects, actually the plant roots themselves, which are probing that soil, which are releasing compounds. Andrea talked about some of those secondary metabolites. That impacts the microbial systems. I think Greg Lardy and John McAvoy are going to be talking after lunch, and we'll hear more about the agrobiome initiative, and I'm sure we'll hear some comments on that regard, about how that whole system fits in with the soil system. We also have issues of the abiotic or the environmental factors of temperature and water. We heard about that, obviously, and we know about that quite extensively in the last year. Carbon dioxide levels in the soil also impact how all of this works together. And I am not just addressing sort of climate change issues, but just even CO2 levels from respiration of those plant roots and microbial activity and insect activity in the soil contributes to that as well. And that all impacts the availability of those mineral nutrients. Those minerals then lead on to induce and have an impact on crop yield. But more importantly, they have a role in how much gets into those plants for their mineral composition. And similarly for the phytochemicals, although phytochemicals are produced through biochemical processes, those biochemical processes in many instances require minerals or metals as cofactors to make those proteins work to be able to make those secondary metabolites. So all of this fits back into the soil mineral availability as a very important component of this. This then leads into the plant and animal nutritional quality and then on into the human nutrition and health. Crop yield also obviously impacts our nutrition and health, but just from providing adequate energy in our foods. Okay, Andrea mentioned about some of one of her slides about some of the components that plants can provide. Again, sort of expanding on this issue of minerals. The soil provides these minerals. We keep in mind that plants can't make minerals. No organism can make a mineral. You have to get it from the environment. And so what's interesting about our soils is that they can provide all the minerals necessary for plant health. The red elements here are what are considered plant essential minerals. The elements in black are things that will get into plants. They're not essential for plants, but fortunately for us as consumers of those plant foods or the livestock that consume those foods, the fact that the plants will take them up and get into the food supply provides them to us as well because they are essential for human health. Now, in a more broad sense, we have not only those minerals, but we have sort of a dry matter yield, which is our protein, energy, and fiber, and all of those are required as essential. The plants are also making vitamins as sort of some of the secondary metabolites that are that area. Things like carotenoids, the zeaxanthin that I mentioned, which is important for macular degeneration. But then we have all these other health-promoting or potentially health-promoting phytochemicals that plants are making as well. And one of the things to keep in mind as we sort of expand on this whole concept of healthy soils, healthy plants, healthy people, is keeping sort of things a little bit separate here from the perspective of nutrients. And from my nutrition background and field, when we talk about nutrients, those are things that are essential for our health. The other compounds, the secondary metabolites, are there so minerals are required for your nutrition. They're essential, that you have good health from having adequate mineral nutrition. and vitamins. But then they have these other compounds that get into our food supply which may have health benefits, but they're not deemed essential necessarily. The Mars Corporation has been trying to get chocolate defined as an essential compound. They haven't quite gotten there yet, but they've been spending a lot of money on research on showing the value of chocolate in your diet. So anyway, what the point is that as we talk about this whole concept and think about the sustainability issues, think about management issues with our soils, the things that we can measure are going to be more on the nutrient level. We can also measure these secondary metabolites. I think it's very important, but it's hard to define how well they impact our health because many of those compounds are still sort of deemed as promotive of good health, but they're not necessarily essential. So it just makes the analysis a little bit tricky. Now, plants have all these things in them. They can get into our food supply, they can feed our livestock, they can feed us, but unfortunately it's not a perfect world. There is a lot of food insecurity and malnutrition throughout parts of the world, especially in developing countries. We know there's a lot of micronutrient deficiencies, especially for iron, zinc, iodine, vitamin A in parts of the world. So even though those plants have all these nutrients, they're not always getting into all the people who need them. Now, we're here in North Dakota. We're thinking in terms of this initiative as it's federal money, U.S. federal money, so we're interested in the health and nutrition of our U.S. citizens. But I think anyone in this room would recognize that we're in a global economy, our food systems are global. North Dakota producers are feeding the world. Our crops and our livestock span around the world. So what we can do in improving the nutritional quality of our foods here in this Northern Plains area really can impact across the world. And what we know about this food insecurity and malnutrition is that nutrient densities are such that few plant or animal foods can supply the total daily needs for any given nutrient in an average serving size. There was some discussion at the end of the last presentation about not looking at just single items, but we need to think about that whole food system. Food insecurity throughout much of the developing world impacts total caloric and nutrient intake. Part of that is lack of dietary diversity, which minimizes that diet nutritional quality. And so, trying to go forward with enhancing the nutritional quality of our food supply is important because it does contribute to that whole diet issue. And so back again to this sort of conceptual model, linking soils with our food supply, our production agriculture, and nutrition. I do believe it all begins with healthy soils. As I mentioned, although organic nutrients can be synthesized, we can't make those minerals, so we have to get that from the soil. And we have to work within a system that has a lot of complexity, as Andrea alluded to in her presentation. And that really poses several challenges to us. And so what I want to do is just talk about those a little bit to kind of, again, give you the framework of what we're going to try and do in this initiative to look at some of the pieces that would hopefully bring all this back together to identify ways through management, through breeding of crops, through processing, through whatever, to improve the quality of our food supply. So there are challenges. We know that soil quality differs across the landscape. Here's just some data on acid versus basic soils. We know that on a more broad scale that this changes across the U.S. quite dramatically. If we look at USGS data on mineral availability in different soils across the U.S., we see things for some of these macro elements, calcium and magnesium. And if you can see even on the North Dakota, if you can sort of pick that out on there, obviously you can see that, sort of a patchwork across that landscape. If we go to the micronutrients, selenium and zinc, again, we have a patchwork across the country. And so what's available in that soil where you grow that plant is going to have an impact on what can actually get into the plant because the plant can't make those elements. It has to pull it out of its environment. We saw some data already on some of the differences we see across crops, either genotypes or species. These are some data for some grain crops. I don't know how well you can see that throughout the room, but the upper plants are some of our legumes, our pulse crops, and then at the bottom, pearl millet, maize, wheat, and rice, and showing just the variation that you get. And these are some studies that were done with multiple genotypes of these, multiple varieties, and show the range of concentrations that you can get, either for iron or zinc, and just maybe a little more detailed look for these pulse crops of chickpea, pea, and lentil. This was a study that we did with 200 to 400, almost 500 pea varieties, grown all under a common environment, and showing the genetic diversity that exists just across those lines. And so that crop quality is already quite variable depending on the starting material, and that has an impact on what we could be doing with it, looking at what our environments are providing them. Now, I think we also saw some earlier data from Andrea on how the environment impacts this. This is some research that we did on dry beans. The data points on here, the upper data points are for seed potassium concentration and seed calcium concentration on the bottom. Each of those lines is a different field site. North Dakota at the top, Michigan, Nebraska, Washington, Colorado, Idaho, and Puerto Rico. And then those 2 points on each of those lines are the 2 field reps in that environment, in that location. So you see there's quite a variation across the landscape depending on where you grow these plants. And so again, part of it is just that availability, and this is where we think, going back to the soil health issues, how that soil health impacts that nutrient availability is going to have an impact on what we can do and produce off of those fields. So we had the environment. Andrea talked about a lot of the complexity that's out there. We're complex. I mean, I've been involved, before I came to Fargo, I was in Houston, Texas for 26 years at a children's nutrition research center. I was involved in clinical studies looking at nutrient availability in humans, and just individual variation in people is quite complex. Because of that, our nutrition colleagues have looked at trying to identify what our nutrient requirements are. There's just variation across individuals, but we also have a variation in requirements across the life stages. These are some showing some numbers for iron on the right-hand side of the figure, and just demonstrating that our needs vary across the life stages, and depending on whether a woman is pregnant or not, or in other stages of the life cycle. On top of that, I think one of the growing challenges that we need to keep our sight on is the challenges posed by climate change effects on higher CO2 levels, drought, either drought or too much water, high temperatures. I had the opportunity to be involved in the chapter on agriculture and rural communities in the 4th National Climate Assessment Report, in which we tried to demonstrate some of the impacts of climate change that we know are out there already, based on some of the studies that have been done in large-scale field experiments, some greenhouse studies, but also in large-scale field experiments, where researchers have demonstrated that it appears that future reductions in iron, zinc, and protein levels may be accrued in our food supply with elevated CO2 levels. And so already we have international problems with iron and zinc deficiency throughout much of the developing world. Many of these crops, without our better intervention of management and varieties, we may be seeing some very significant declines in iron and zinc and protein levels. And to Andrea's comments about the secondary metabolites and phytochemicals, it's very interesting that while researchers have focused on these essential nutrients, there have been very few studies on elevated CO2 impacts on some of these phytochemicals. Studies are out there, but they're very few and far between, And I think that's another area that we need to have some research done in. So, excuse me, back to this, this sort of broader conceptual model and asking how can we meet caloric and nutritional food security needs. I think we do need to continue to look at how we can integrate and how this new initiative will give us an opportunity to set up researchable questions to address how we can improve our soil health and demonstrate how it may impact our nutritional quality of our food supply and link that on into our human nutrition and health. Now, having said that, and thinking about how we can make those improvements and recognizing that we do want all foods to be nutritious because of just capacity of researchers and capacity of programs and financing, we really do need to use our best science to carefully consider where to invest our improvement strategies. What foods, what crops should we target, and at what level of improvement? What level of improvement will have an impact on human health if we can demonstrate that these healthier soils are improving nutrient density? And so when we think about that from a nutrition scientist perspective, we recognize that this nutritional impact will be related to how much a person eats of that particular food, what is the nutrient concentration in that food, and what is the percent bioavailability of that nutrient. And that all relative to one's daily requirements. And I already mentioned that across the life stages, those requirements are changing. And so nutrition science has provided us with some of the baseline information that we need, and social science research has provided us with some ideas on national consumption surveys and national consumption data, which in the past and ongoing has informed crop breeders about the crops and nutrient target levels that could have a nutritional impact at the population level. We have baseline nutrient levels. USDA has a nutrient database, a food nutrient database. They go out and collect material from across the U.S. in grocery stores. And that data is available online, and nutritionists and dietitians use that as sort of a baseline values of what our food supply looks like. And so if we have those numbers, we know what kind of, also we have data on what people eat. This whole aspect of nutrient bioavailability is another area that's very important. Some of the issues, we were talking about zinc earlier, and so nutrient bioavailability, just as crops in the field, the availability of all those minerals, the plants only get a certain amount of those minerals out of the field. When we consume foods, this is the image on the left is a gut enterocyte with the microvilli showing where food is digested and absorbed. Bioavailability in a broader sense is how well you do that digestion and absorption and utilization throughout the body. And it's often kind of referred to as, this comment I think everyone has heard, you are what you eat. Okay, it's kind of a common phrase that you hear. Well, actually that's not really correct. It's really you are what you don't excrete. Because you only absorb a certain percentage of the nutrients that pass through the gut. Something like zinc from many plant foods, maybe only about 5% of the zinc is absorbed. Iron is maybe even less than that. So it really depends on the food, the form of the food, what other factors are in the diet. And so that nutrient bioavailability is very important in our considerations of what crops we might want to look at in order to bring all this together from the soils to the plants to the people. Now, just finishing up, I wanted to kind of give you another example of one of these sort of broad longitudinal studies that looked across varieties over the years, and this question of has the quality of our food supply gone down? We saw some of the data on some of the wheat and with the short-statured wheat and how that might be impacting some of the nutrient density within those. We did a study, I had a colleague, USDA colleague in South Carolina, Mark Farnham, who was a broccoli breeder. We've been doing some work on broccoli, and we got the idea at one point to take a number of the hybrids of what he could still find hybrid seeds on. When hybrid varieties sort of go out of favor, they just don't keep producing them anymore. But we were able to go back to the early 1950s. We took 14 hybrid varieties and one open pollinated variety. We grew them in common field experiment in a couple of environments and looked at mineral concentrations across those. And the idea was that, as in many crops, breeders have been breeding for yield. That's what's important to the producer. They're breeding for disease resistance because it impacts yield. And they're not necessarily breeding for nutritional quality. Now, some crops, obviously, they're breeding for protein quality, maybe some, in wheat, baking quality, that sort of thing. Sometimes in vegetable crops, they're breeding for post-harvest issues. But by and large, they're breeding for yield and haven't been looking at nutritional quality, and so we wanted to see what had happened. If no one had been looking, in this case with broccoli, had there been any changes. And in fact, we found really no significant changes in mineral concentrations across those years. And it wasn't clean. It was a little sloppy, some of the data, and here's some data for calcium. Basically, really no trend. I mean, there's some of the hybrids were a little higher, some were a little bit lower, but no real trend and no real decline. Well, a little bit after we published this paper, Mark got asked to give a talk at the American Society of Horticultural Sciences annual meeting to talk about this question of is our food supply getting less nutritious? And he got the great idea. He said, well, hey, over the years of these different varieties, our annual consumption of broccoli has gone up quite a bit. Back in the 1950s, the per capita consumption of broccoli was about a pound a year, and into the early 2010s, it's now close to 10 pounds of broccoli. Now, I don't know how many people eat 10 pounds of broccoli, but this is what the national trends are showing. Now, I will say, in all honesty, these are trends for purchases. It doesn't really probably equate totally with consumption because there's waste. But anyway, he took these numbers and he said, all right, let me take the calcium concentration of this variety, this hybrid back in the 1950s, and figure out what it would contribute for your calcium based on its concentration at that quantity consumed. We're not going to factor in the bioavailability right now, but just look at what that would provide. And so back then, it would have given us 154 milligrams of calcium and a little over 1,500 milligrams of calcium in the 2010s. So the calcium RDA for, let's pick one life stage, a 19 to 30-year-old male, is 1,000 milligrams. So I get this email from Mark, and he's all excited. He says, oh, my, look what broccoli provides. We're getting all this calcium out of it. And I got the email, I looked at the number, and I was just devastated. I thought, the math must be wrong. This can't be right. Now, Mark's not a nutritionist. He's a breeder. I mean, he's a good scientist, but he doesn't, track the nutrition data and the information like I was, having been embedded at a human nutrition center. So what's wrong with this picture? Per year. Whoops. That figure represents annual consumption of broccoli. The RDA is a recommended daily allowance for calcium. So if you consume today's U.S. pattern of about 10 pounds of broccoli a year, a male at this age, or any of us, would basically get about 1.5 days worth of your calcium over the whole year. Okay, so what that tells us is that even if this calcium level in broccoli is going down by 10 or 20%, and again, we want to have the most nutritious food supply we can, but what's the impact on our health going to be? It's not going to really hit us all that well. We still would like to raise the level, but even if it goes up or down a little bit, it's not going to break the bank. So with that in mind, really these consumption patterns, baseline mineral concentrations, we really need to think about those when we consider which foods we want to target in our studies, and where we will have the biggest impact. And so where we have been involved in over the years is looking at our staple food supply: wheat, beans, rice, corn, those sorts of things where we are consuming a large part of our daily diet in those foods. If we target those for nutritional improvement, we believe we can have a big impact on health. Now, having said that, I'm sure there's probably going to be broccoli on the lunch meal today, so should you eat it? I don't want to send you away here thinking, well, now I don't have to eat broccoli. You're not going to get a lot of calcium out of it, but you will get other things. You'd get in a half-cup serving 1.2 grams of fiber, not very much towards your RDA, but we don't get a lot of fiber in the U.S. diet, so anytime you can get some is a good thing. You get almost half of your daily requirement for vitamin C, a little over a third of your daily requirement for vitamin K. And then we've got all these wonderful secondary metabolites in broccoli: glucosinolates, phenolic acids, flavonoids, that again, we can't put a number on how much they're going to impact your health, but we know that they do have an impact, or they have been demonstrated to have an impact on our nutritional quality. So the last slide here, just sort of trying to wrap this up, and what I've tried to do is give you a little bit of a conceptual framework for how this initiative might go forward. We want to look at these issues of what soil health improvements can do with our food supply. Some of the goals that we might consider, and this is just some that I've put together and have pulled out of some of the literature, the white paper that was put together originally, and some other ideas, would be to assess the potential to improve both crop varieties and soil health as a joint enhancement of food nutritional quality. And I think also breeding nutritionally enhanced crop varieties that can take advantage of healthy soil environments is another direction that we can take. So not only looking at what sort of feed forward the soil provides to the plants, but let's look at really bringing the plants back into the equation. We need to understand how our soil types respond to climate variables and to the crops again. We want to increase sustainability of these ag systems and understand how our management practices can do that. And we really want to add value to our agricultural production by ultimately improving human health. So I think these are some areas that we can work on. And I'm excited to be part of this team, to have responsibility and role at the lab in Fargo. And I look forward to providing you folks with more information in the years to come. So with that, I'll leave you with this last slide and be happy to take any questions if there's time.
As a diabetic, I probably do eat 10 pounds of broccoli.
Okay, good.
My wife is a dietitian with the WIC program, and she gets with all the infected kids all the time. I probably haven't been sick for 2 or 3 years at all. I do take care of my diet and things, especially with my wife being a dietitian. Not nearly as much as she takes care of herself. But she gets colds all the time, and first thing she does is grab the Zicam and swabs her nose for the zinc. Mm-hmm. So my question is, the lack of zinc in her diet, plus her inoculum from her work, are we getting sick more often because we don't have these things like zinc in our diets?
Well, it's not that we don't have zinc in our diets. I think there may be foods where, zinc is maybe a little lower than at other times. It's hard to say. I mean, again, zinc is not necessarily one of the nutrients of concern in the U.S. diet. I mean, we don't have a tremendously high zinc requirement. Some of these issues with zinc, with the Zicam, I think are by going over the RDA, and not to a level that's going to be a negative issue, but providing more of that because it does help with our antioxidant load in our systems. is probably having some benefits. You know, we have a mixed diet. We have a lot of sources of all these minerals, and also how those foods are processed, how the other sort of promotive and inhibitory compounds that are in our diets, that all factors together. So it's really hard to say and sort of pin it on that itself. You're not getting sick there. Maybe you're just living the stress-free life at the Mandan lab, and you're in good shape. So that's, yeah.
Mike, I got a question over here.
So I understand, like at the elevator, we don't get a premium for increased mineral values. So from a more scientific or food nutrition standpoint, like Andrea said, you can see the decreasing minerals in our grain. So is there anything we can do, like a foliar applied fertilizer, or can you see it in your tissue tests, these decreased mineral values, and can we improve that?
You would see it. I mean, some of the minerals, iron for instance, is kind of a tough one. Sometimes, I mean, you can definitely get iron deficiency. Sometimes the iron levels in the foliar analysis will be normal, but internally in the plant that iron isn't necessarily as available. There are foliar sprays for the micronutrients, usually in a chelated form that helps for absorption and gets it into the plant. Studies that we've done, I mean, going back to the wheat issue, iron is a nutrient that gets into the plant, and there are so many control points of getting iron from the roots through the plant into the leaves and on into the seeds. Iron can be very toxic in excess, and so the plant and any organism is really very cautious about what it does with iron. Zinc, on the other hand, if you add more zinc to your fertilizers, if you have more zinc foliar, you will see higher zinc levels in the grains. The plant is a little bit more forthcoming with moving it through the system. And so there are ways to do that. There are soils around the world where zinc is very low. Then they are putting zinc into fertilizers. Turkey, I have colleagues in Turkey where they have very low zinc soils in certain areas where wheat production is going on. And there's an added benefit to the producer that those grains that have a little bit higher zinc level in them, they actually have a better seedling establishment, better seedling vigor, and so it actually helps overall with production systems as well, not just the human consumption of the grains.
I have a question. So I'm a dietitian. Oh, this is really loud.
Hi.
And I've always been very frustrated that our profession doesn't talk about the soil or the land or anything like that. And I would have been desperate for this kind of information when I was in school. I was wondering if you guys are looking to partner. I know NDSU has a dietetic program, UND does. Are you guys partnering or looking to partner with the health professional side of things at those institutions?
We could. I don't think we're off the ground yet and running to jump in with that. But I think as we move forward and start identifying which questions we want to address, I would hope we would partner with whoever we can to pull people into this. Clearly, at least I know at our lab, and I know Mandan as well. I mean, we have good partnerships with NDSU. And so we would hope to expand those as well. But yeah, I've given talks over the years for nutrition departments, dietetics, seminars and whatnot. And the interesting thing I've always found is that people get kind of freaked out when I start telling them how much variation there is in our food supply. That the nutrient database numbers, which are sort of one number, don't really represent what's out there in the real world, coming off the farm. So it's always an interesting conversation, which I think should be expanded. It would be good to do that.
All right, that's it for Mike. Let's give Mike a hand.
Thank you very much.